America is a land haunted by history. The towns and cities and rural communities that we walk through have stories to tell. But some of those stories have been suppressed. That's because the essential diversity of American life has too often been erased, sometimes by brutal acts of violence. And that's especially true for African American communities in cities and towns like Wilmington, North Carolina, East St. Louis, Illinois, and Ocoee, Florida, which briefly flourished after Reconstruction, only to be snuffed out by midnight rioters, lynching, and riots. I'm John Avlon, and this is our series, History Refocused, where we talk about the stories you should have learned in school, but probably didn't. Now, our country belatedly confronted this brutal legacy when we recently marked the 100th anniversary of the race riots that destroyed Greenwood, a once prosperous black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that had been all but written out of our history. And it's essential that we remember these dozens of stories, taking them out of the ash heap of history, so that we can honor the individuals who were denied life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we can learn the right lessons and emerge with a more complete understanding of our shared history. Because these incidents are not just the story of one family or one community. It is not only black history, it is American history. The good, the bad, and the ugly that makes us who we are today. Now take the story of Joseph Kellogg and his descendants in Forsyth County, Georgia, which in the decades after slavery's end briefly became one of the most prosperous families in the area, black or white. But then it all came crashing down. CNN's Ryan Young tells us the story.
My father always talked about owning land. It made you a man.
Elon Osby is a descendant of the Bagley family. Her family owned 60 acres in Forsyth County, Georgia, northeast of Atlanta. Though it was a mostly white farming community, the Bagleys were one of hundreds of black families thriving in the area. That is, until a tragic event in 1912. In September of that year, an 18-year-old white woman named Mae Crow was beaten and raped. She later died from her injuries. The backlash from the white community was severe. 3 black men and a young black woman were accused of the crime and thrown in jail. One of them was a 24-year-old named Rob Edwards.
The crowd went straight to Rob Edwards, who was cowering on the floor of the jail cell and crying. And they beat him to death with a crowbar, and then they shot him several times and dragged him out. And then they hanged his body somewhere near the courthouse square.
A historical marker remembering the lynching was erected with help from the Equal Justice Initiative. The group says they've worked with nearly 50 other communities who put up similar markers around the country. But the sign here has become the spark for a much deeper conversation about what else was really lost in 1912. That was only the beginning of the violence. Groups of night riders terrorized black families, threatening them to leave.
They were forced to leave. Their property was burned, homes burned, everything that they weren't able to gather on a wagon and save was lost.
Denise Boyd's great-grandfather Joseph owned 200 acres. The family tried to hang on, but sold up and left after a few years.
He had the only working sawmill in Forsyth County. Eventually it got to Joseph, and that's when he just packed up my mother and them and they left.
Forsyth County was not an anomaly. Hundreds of counties expelled their black communities following similar patterns. White rioters lynched 3 black men and banished dozens in Pierce City, Missouri over the murder of a white woman in 1901. In 1909, white residents in Anna, Illinois drove out nearly an entire black community after a black man was accused of raping a white woman. And the 1921 massacre and erasure of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma began after a black man was accused of assaulting a white woman.
These banishments had a ripple effect, denying the ability of these families to pass on land, creating a wealth gap where the families weren't able to build on the success of their ancestors.
Joining us now to discuss this legacy of racial violence in the century after the Civil War is Professor and historian Jeff Ward, who's been working to digitally catalog these violent events from the 1960s back to the Civil War. Professor Ward, thanks for joining us. Now, tell us about events like Forsyth and Tulsa, which are brutal attacks on black communities, but you say there's another place to start in this conversation, and it goes back to Abraham Lincoln before he was president.
Right, John. Thank you for having me. I think it's very important that as a nation we grapple with the full scope of these events and their continued legacies. As you point out, they haunt us economically, politically, socially. You mentioned there being dozens of these events, but in fact there have been thousands of these events. Just lynchings alone number in the around 6,000 at least documented lynchings, and that story is still incomplete. In terms of Abraham Lincoln's reflections on these events, then one of Abraham Lincoln's first published speeches, The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions, it was entitled, and he's reflecting on a growing wave of racial terror events, arguing that both the widespread expression of these events, but also the indulgence of what he called this mobocratic spirit, threatened the rule of law and the public commons that our form of government depended on. He was thinking, especially at that time, of the 1836 lynching of Francis McIntosh here in St. Louis and the subsequent assassination of the abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy. He's identifying the concern that mass violence will become recognized as a legitimate form of political expression, of white political expression, and that will fundamentally degrade the rule of law and legitimacy of our state institutions.
That same speech is where Lincoln says, as a nation of free men, we must live for all time or die by suicide. And that's what I think this resistance to multiracial democracy and majoritarian democracy continues to represent.
There are many instances where outraged whites simply mobilized in the 1863 New York City draft riots. You know, this was one of the many pogroms where there was an attempt to destroy the African American community. That event displaced over 1,000 African Americans, and it was sparked by the corruption of the draft process by which people would be drawn into the Union ranks, and the resentment against African Americans was expressed in this event.
And pitting African Americans and immigrants against each other with a corrupt, unjust process. There's class struggles in the draft riots. It really is a seminal moment for that reason. I want to end on this note because we're talking about the displacement of families, the erasure of history, but also the displacement of assets. I mean, there are real monetary costs in addition to the blood that was shed. The erasure and basically theft of what amounts to millions of dollars by these communities, by these families that were hard won. And I wonder what you make of that collective loss of not only dollars, but the larger question of how we can make ourselves whole again for those directly affected, those survivors and the descendants of survivors, really.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess I want to say a couple things. One is that we really lack a complete record of this history of racist violence that would be necessary to truly take stock of the costs. Important to note here also, though, is that we've only really just begun as a nation to bring into this conversation the anti-Asian violence, the anti-Mexican violence, the racist violence targeting Native American and other populations. We don't have yet a really comprehensive and inclusive historical record of racist violence. I think an optimistic view is that we're making progress as a nation in kind of moving away from this nonsense of color blindness and realizing that we have to grapple with these haunting legacies. And I think, we see this with mayors around the city committed to reparations. We see it with the work Equal Justice Initiative is doing in community remembrance projects and its National Memorial.
Well, it's certainly a history we need to reckon with. And returning to Lincoln, and really many of the figures of the second founding of the Civil War era, people like Frederick Douglass, who spoke of a composite nation made up of individuals from every group. The place we will ultimately need to work towards getting is a place of what Lincoln called universal freedom, universal individualism, where we transcend ultimately with all these divides without ignoring the history that got us here. Professor, Thank you very much for joining us. All right, that's it for this episode of History Refocused. Please join us again as we continue telling forgotten stories from American history. I'm John Avlon.